You know, some stories are just so remarkable. They feel like they belong in a novel. A story of tragedy, of immense power, of survival against all odds, and then an unbelievable comeback. Today, we're going to explore the life of a woman who was never supposed to be a leader, but who ended up shaping the destiny of a nation. This is the story of Khaleda Zia. So, let's set the scene. It's August 2024. Massive protests, led by students, have brought Bangladesh to a standstill. After 15 long years in power, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina resigns and flees the country. The military moves in to secure the peace. An interim government is cobbled together, and an entire nation is just holding its breath, wondering what comes next. And right in the middle of all this upheaval, a frail 79-year-old woman is suddenly pardoned. For years, she's been a convicted criminal, confined to her home, battling severe illness. Her name is Khaleda Zia. And her newfound freedom sparks the huge question we're going to tackle today. After everything she has been through, is it even possible for her to return and lead Bangladesh one more time? To really get a handle on this, we're going to take a journey through her entire life. We'll start with her sudden return, then rewind all the way back to her early days as a general's wife. We'll look at the tragedy that turned her from a widow into a leader, explore her years in power and the bitter rivalry that defined them, document her fall into imprisonment and illness, and finally, try to make sense of her complex and unfinished legacy. Okay, so first up, let's talk about the dramatic events that put her name back on the world stage. I mean, for years, Khaleda Zia was effectively a ghost in Bangladeshi politics, legally banned, physically unwell, and then a revolution just changed everything overnight. What started out as student protests over job quotas just exploded into this nationwide movement against authoritarian rule. On August 5th, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was gone. The military secured the country, and a new interim government, led by the Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, took over. And one of the very first things they did? They turned their attention to the fate of Hasina's greatest rival, setting the stage for Khaleda Zia's incredible comeback. But to really understand just how extraordinary this journey is, we have to go way back to the very beginning, to a life that was never, ever meant for the spotlight. Khaleda was born in 1945 into a very traditional, conservative family. Her dad was a successful businessman, and her upbringing was, well, completely conventional for that time. The idea was for her to be a wife and a mother. A life in politics? That wasn't even on the radar. Nothing about her quiet childhood hinted at the powerhouse she would become. And then, something happens that changes everything. At just 15 years old, she was married to a young army captain named Ziaur Rahman. It was an arranged marriage, pretty typical for her background. But this wasn't just any soldier. This marriage would end up changing not only her life, but the entire course of Bangladeshi history. You have to understand who her husband was. Ziaur Rahman became a national hero during the 1971 Liberation War. He was the one who famously declared independence over the radio. After a really chaotic period, he rose to become president in 1977. He then founded the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, creating this huge new political force. He was, simply put, a giant of Bangladeshi history. So you might be asking, where was Khaleda during all of this? Well, she was exactly where society expected her to be, in the background. She was the president's wife, a mother to their two sons. She played the part of the first lady, but she gave no speeches, held no official position. She was a complete political outsider, living right at the very center of power. Her quiet private life was absolutely shattered by an act of shocking violence. A single day would transform her from the president's wife into a grieving widow, and in doing so, it would set her on a path she never, ever chose for herself. On May 30th, 1981, President Ziaur Rahman was assassinated by a group of army officers during a coup attempt. He was only 45. At 36, Khaleda Zia's entire world just collapsed. She was suddenly a widow, left alone with two young sons as her nation was once again thrown into chaos. I mean, you can see the change right here. Her life was split into two completely different parts. Before the assassination, her world was private, domestic, completely apolitical. After, she became this instant public figure, a symbol of her husband's martyrdom. She wasn't just Khaleda anymore, she was Zia's widow, the living embodiment of his legacy. For 3 years, she mourned in private. But her husband's party, the BNP, was lost without its charismatic founder. So in 1984, the party came to her. They turned to the one person who could unite them, the keeper of the Zia name. And this is a really crucial point. She didn't go looking for power. Power came looking for her. Just like that, a housewife with zero political experience was now the head of a major national party. A lot of people just wrote her off as a figurehead, but they were so wrong. Throughout the 1980s, under the military dictatorship of General Ershad, she transformed. She was out on the streets, leading protests, demanding democracy. The quiet president's wife became this fierce opposition leader, facing down tear gas, police crackdowns, and being arrested multiple times. And every time she was detained, her popularity just soared. She was becoming a true symbol of resistance. So, all those years of struggle, they worked. By the early 1990s, the military regime fell, and Bangladesh was ready for democracy. This shift would propel her to the very top and right into one of the most famous and bitter political rivalries of our time. In 1991, her party, the BNP, won the general election, and Khaleda Zia, the woman who was never supposed to be in politics, became the very first female prime minister of Bangladesh. Think about that. At the time, she was one of only a handful of female heads of government in the entire world. It was a massive moment. Her first term, from 91 to 96, was, well, it was a mixed bag. On the one hand, her government pushed for economic liberalization and built a lot of infrastructure. And critically, she introduced something called the caretaker government system, a neutral body to oversee fair elections. Ironically, that system would later become a huge point of conflict. But on the other hand, her government was dogged by constant protests and accusations of corruption. And the person leading that opposition was Sheikh Hasina. Look, you really can't talk about Bangladeshi politics without understanding this rivalry. It's not just political. It's deeply, deeply personal. It was forged in parallel tragedies. Hasina's father, the nation's founder, was assassinated in 75. Zia's husband, who rose to power after that, was assassinated in 81. Both women inherited these powerful legacies born from violence, and their feud would basically define and polarize the nation for decades. After a few years in opposition, Khaleda Zia came roaring back to power in 2001. But her second term was way more turbulent. There was a brutal anti-crime crackdown called Operation Clean Heart that drew heavy criticism. Corruption allegations were rampant, so much so that Transparency International named Bangladesh the world's most corrupt country 5 years in a row under her rule. Plus, her political alliance with the Islamist party Jamaat-e-Islami was hugely controversial. That chaotic end to her second term spiraled into a political crisis that would ultimately lead to her downfall. The years that followed were grim. She was stripped of power, put on trial, and eventually confined to a prison cell as her health began to give way. So let's walk through how this happened. Her term ends in 2006, and there's a huge fight over that caretaker government system. The country descends into chaos. In early 2007, the military steps in and declares a state of emergency. Both Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina get arrested on corruption charges. Though she was let out to run in the 2008 election, she lost badly to Hasina. And that really began a long, slow decline that ended 10 years later, in 2018, when she was officially convicted and sent to prison. And the case that finally brought her down, it all boiled down to this one number: 21 million taka. That was roughly $250,000 at the time. The official charge was embezzlement. The court said she was guilty of misusing funds that were meant for an orphanage named after her late husband. She got 5 years, a sentence that was even increased later on. But she and her party, the BNP, have always maintained that the charges were a complete setup, that they were politically motivated and designed by Sheikh Hasina's government just to get her out of the way for good. And while she was in prison, her health, which was already fragile, just completely fell apart. We're talking liver cirrhosis, crippling arthritis, severe complications from diabetes. Her body was failing. Her family begged the government to let her get treatment abroad, but they were repeatedly denied. Then, in March 2020, as the pandemic was taking hold, the government suspended her sentence. So she was out of her prison cell, but she wasn't truly free. She was effectively under house arrest, couldn't leave her home in Dhaka, and crucially, she was still legally forbidden from taking part in any political activity. For all intents and purposes, it really seemed like her story was finally over. And that brings us right back to where we started, August 2024. A revolution that nobody saw coming didn't just topple a government, it completely rewrote what seemed to be the final chapter of Khaleda Zia's life. And what happened next was just incredibly fast. First, the revolution forces her arch-rival, Sheikh Hasina, into exile. Then, the new interim government immediately lifts all the restrictions on her. Soon after that,
The president of Bangladesh grants her a full pardon, completely wiping her criminal record clean. In just a matter of days, Khaleda Zia went from a convicted criminal under house arrest to a free citizen with all her political rights restored.
So, how will history remember her? Well, it really depends on who you ask. To her millions of supporters, she is a democratic icon, a brave woman who stood up to a dictator and then suffered for years with dignity. But to her critics, she was the leader of deeply corrupt governments who made shady alliances and failed to protect human rights. The truth, as it usually is probably somewhere in the very complicated space between those two extremes. The young people who led this revolution, they grew up entirely under the shadow of the Zia-Hasina rivalry. In a lot of ways, their protest was a rejection of that whole brand of politics. And so the huge question now isn't just about Khaleda Zia's future. It's about whether Bangladesh itself can finally move on from the tragic, polarizing legacies of these two families that have dominated it for so long. In the end, no matter what you think of her politics, her legacy is one of pure, astonishing endurance. She was pushed into politics by tragedy, not by choice. She rose to the highest office in her country, was thrown into prison, and fought off debilitating illness. Time and time again, people wrote her off, but she always survived. Whether this is her final act or not, her story is already woven into the fabric of her nation. The story of a housewife who became a prime minister, a prisoner who became free, and a woman who simply refused to be erased from history.